Hello guys, this is CannibalChess, and in this video we're going to be talking about the bishop, and specifically we're going to be going over where you want your bishop to be placed in different stages of the game, the main functions of the bishop, what a hyperactive bishop looks like, and then lastly we're going to be going over when would you want to trade your bishops off the board, so when would they be the most useless that they could be to where you wouldn't want them in the game anymore. So to start the video, we're just going to be going into where you want your bishops to be placed in the opening stages of a chess game. Okay, so if you are playing as white and you decide to go e4, your opponent usually plays e5, and then here you already have a chance to develop your light square bishop to a pretty decent diagonal. So you play bishop c4, and then now your bishop is hitting this weak f7 pawn on the king side. It's also keeping the d pawn from coming to d5 and then attacking the center of the board. And here, if you don't want to develop your light square bishop, you could also develop your knight, of course, but then as well you could play something like b3. And the computer is saying that's an awful idea, but it's still a pretty good move because you're getting your pieces developed. And so this would be putting the dark square bishop. It's not on an open diagonal, but it's hitting this pawn, this weak pawn that's on e5. It's not being guarded right now. So after you play something like that, your opponent could play something like this. After you get your bishop fianchettoed, then it's a perfectly fine position for white because your bishop has this very long diagonal to try and get control of over the course of the game. You could play something like f4 at some point, and then get their pawn to take, and then have the diagonal fully open for the dark square bishop. So those are different places that you could have your bishop in the opening. And the last place you would want your bishop to go if you were still playing in the opening, you could play something like knight here, and then they would play there to defend their pawn, and then you could bring your bishop over here. And so you're creating this idea of pinning the knight. So now if they play this move d6 and try and create a pawn chain, then you're pinning the knight to the king. It's pretty hard to get the knight unpinned. They might play something like a6 to try and kick away the bishop, but then you can just drop the bishop back to something like a4, and then they'll push again. And the idea is that you're just getting them to commit to different pawn pushes. So they could play something like this, and then you would just drop your bishop back all the way over here, and then now it's still on this same diagonal hitting the f7 pawn. So it's still a perfectly good position for white. It's actually a little bit better for white. So you're just getting them to commit to early pawn pushes. And so this would also be an idea that you could play in a chess game where you get your bishop on a diagonal where it's hitting the knight and the king, or also there are some situations where you can play something like d3 and then get the other bishop pinning the other knight on f6, something like that. So if they play here, and then you play there, and then they play something like this, then you could play this other bishop move, and then now you have both the queen and the king having pins on them with separate knights. So that's the last place that you could have your bishop in the opening. All these are perfectly fine places for the bishop to be. It just depends on what opening you play as well. So now we're going to be going into where you want your bishop to be placed in the middle game. Okay, so now we're going to be switching over to black, and here in this position, there are a few things that both of these bishops are doing. So this light square bishop on d7, if you notice, this knight is hitting all of these squares, and this bishop is keeping the knight from coming to any of these light squares. And so this is a well-known tactic in chess for most people, where if you place the bishop directly under the knight, it's like 3 squares under the knight, it's going to be hitting all 4 of these squares that the knight could potentially come to and threaten black's camp. So the light square bishop here is defending this pawn, but it's also keeping the knight from jumping to squares like these. And then the dark square bishop it's defending the queen from this dark square bishop's range. So in this position, the dark square bishop is just acting as a defense piece. It's keeping this dark square bishop from having unlimited range all the way to d8. And the reason why this is an important place for the dark square bishop to be in this point is because you want your queen or your rooks to be able to come to d8 at some point and then be able to push pawns. So that's why this diagonal is important. That's why white's hitting this diagonal, and that's why the dark square bishop is defending that diagonal. So those are a few functions of bishops in the middle game. The last function I'm going to be going over real quick for middle game is when bishops are on some square like b7 here, and they're basically keeping pieces like bishops and queens from coming to this open diagonal, and then making it to where the king doesn't have any escape squares on b7 or a8, stuff like that. So it would be cutting off escape squares. So the bishop here is just keeping this open diagonal safe for the king. Now, if you look at white here, there's an open diagonal that the dark square bishop for black can come to and kind of mess with the white king. So the dark square bishop could come to h6 and then be hitting this long diagonal and then check the king. And there's really no way in this position for white to cover the king. The dark square bishop's stuck over here, so it doesn't have any move like this where it could come and block that diagonal off for the other dark square bishop. The queen, you don't really want your queen to block because then your opponent would just take. So the king has to move over, and then once the king moves over, then the dark square bishop has control of all these squares. The rook can't come to this square, the queen can't come to this one. So it's just a lot of trouble for white in that position. And the reason why I'm talking about functions, I know it might seem I'm going out of order, but in the middle game, bishops, where they are placed, depends on their function in that game and in that specific situation. So that's why I'm going over the functions while also going over where you want to place them in the middle game. Okay, so now in the end game it's kind of where bishops are the most valuable in most chess games. In this situation, the bishop here is acting as a defense for the backwards pawn on g6, and there's nothing that the bishop can really do about these dark squared pawns. You know, the king has to just be there to defend those, but what the bishop can also do here is if white, because most of the pawns are on this side of the board, if white tries to push these pawns too far and this pawn on b3 starts coming up the board to maybe b4 or something like that at some point, then white can no longer really play some moves like d6, because then this backwards pawn would be hanging for the bishop to take. So the bishop here is doing a very important job keeping this backwards pawn defended, and then that pawn can defend h5 and f5, and that's why the position here is equal for black. Not only are they are up a few pawns, but they also have double pawns, but the bishop here is doing its job as it should, defending the pawns and also keeping these pawns in check as well. And here we finally see the light square bishop in its final form, which is the bishop or the hyperactive bishop. And so it's basically performing all the tasks that a bishop should in a chess game. So here it's cutting off the h7 square, the rook's also helping, so the pawn can't really come down here unless this rook also helps push the pawn. So they're defending h7 together. The bishop can also not be attacked. If the rook tries to come over here, then the pawn can just be pushed, and then the rook can't really capture because this rook's guarding it. So the bishop can't really be threatened, and so it's also defending f1. So if the rook tries to go for this idea, you could also push f1, and then if they try and do here, then the bishop is also defending that square as well, and the bishop's also covering these squares. So if the king over here with the pawns tries to do some sneaky ideas of pushing the pawns or something like that, then the bishop could help attack those as well. So there's really nothing that the bishop can't do here. It's basically an invincible piece at this point. It's hitting all of these squares perfectly. It's almost in the center of the board. So this is the perfect example of a hyperactive bishop, but I will show y'all a few more examples after we finish covering the endgames. And here is the last function that we're going to be talking about for bishops in endgames. So as you can see here, the pawn and the bishop, they are guarding each other. And this is kind of a unique thing that bishops and pawns can do. I know queens Queens, because they can move diagonal too, they can do this with the pawn as well, but queens aren't usually stationary long enough. Bishops are a little bit better about being stationary. It's usually better for your bishop to be stationary than your queen. Your queen needs to be going around threatening checkmate and stuff like that. So this is one thing that you can see here. The rook can't really take the bishop because then the pawn would retake, and then black would just be easily winning. And then if the rook takes the pawn, you wouldn't retake back just because of how the position is. It would just be a draw because then the rook would just take on a6. But also interestingly here, there's another function that the light square bishop is performing, and it is making a barrier with this pawn because the pawn's defending the bishop. It's making a barrier so that this rook cannot come to a2 and then defend this pawn on a6. So bishops can also, in some cases, this is one of the examples, the bishops can act as just barriers. When they're with pawns, they can act as a barrier. So this rook's kind of trapped in this little 3x3 area. It can't really get out unless it goes h2 and then it maybe comes down to h4 or something like that, but that's like too many moves. And it would even be hard for white to play something like rook to h2 and then try and trade roles so that this rook gets a little bit more active. That would still be pretty difficult. So this pawn's going to fall no matter what just because of this bishop barrier. And as promised, here is another example of hyperactive bishops, and I'm just going to show you all this one example because there are two bishops in this position for white that I would consider as being hyperactive, and also because I don't want this video to take too much longer. We still have to go over when to trade down bishops, so we're just going to go over this real quick and then get into that. So just from looking at this position for a few seconds, you can probably tell that this bishop on b2 is controlling one of the longest diagonals in the game. It's also cutting off the g7 and h8 squares, so the king's kind of trapped on this g8 square. It doesn't really have anywhere to go if it were to be attacked, so it's already kind of crammed for the king here. And also this bishop on g2, it doesn't really look like it's doing much, but it's actually doing its job quite well. So it is also on one of the longest diagonals in the game, but also if black were to try and close this diagonal down from the dark square bishop, then the light square bishop could come over here and take this pawn, and then it would be hyperactive then, because now it's checking the king. The king would have to move over if the knight weren't here to take it. So after the knight takes, then the queen takes, and now the queen is hitting this diagonal. The bishop's hitting this one, so this is a very nasty position for black. So black here would have to play something like bishop to e6 and then kick the queen off the diagonal, so the queen would go back to something like queen to g2 or something like that, and then take the place of the light square bishop on g2 and then still be hitting this long diagonal. So this would just kind of be a nasty position for black in general, just because the king side is really weak now because of that light square bishop coming and attacking the diagonal that the king's on, and also just because of this very strong bishop on b2. Okay, so here is a perfect example as white when you would want to get your bishops off the board as soon as possible. So this bishop on f3 is definitely blocking the way for this knight to possibly come here. If the bishop could go to something like h5, try and get itself off the board, black might play something like pawn to g6, and then you could trade down the black might take with the knight, and then you could get the bishop off the board that way, and then you might be able to play something like a knight over here to f3, try and push this pawn, and then get this diagonal open for the dark square bishop to come to. But also here, the dark square bishop isn't as bad. It looks worse because it's still on the starting square, but it's not really blocking any knights or anything or pieces from getting to where they need to go to start an attack. The knight can still come over here to b3, and then that's why in this position in closed pawn structures like this, knights are better because they can hop over pawns like this. They can jump from b3 to something like c5 or something like that, or push help the pawn get over here, and then create an open way for the queen to come to this diagonal, something like that. But also coming back to this dark square bishop here, a way to get it out, you could play something like a3, and they wouldn't want to push the pawn because then you would just take, so they would have to after you push, they would have to take, and then you retake, and then you could push the pawn up and then make a way for the dark square bishop to come to a3, and then challenge black's dark square bishop as well. So those are a few ideas of how to get bishops off the board too. But yeah, just know that knights here are definitely much better. You definitely want to have knights in this kind of position. But yeah, this was my quick guide for bishops. I hope y'all enjoyed this video, and I'm actually going to make this a series, so I'm going to be going over all the chess pieces and just giving y'all quick guides like this to help y'all out. And I know that there was a few things I missed in this video. I could have gone over something like discovered checks, stuff like that. So if y'all want me to make another video on bishops or just a concept in general, be sure to leave a comment telling me below. And thanks for watching.